welcome for those of you in attendance in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and around the world to this Explore Your Archives Week event, very kindly hosted by Prony. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest. As the David Letterman program says, our guest needs no further introduction, but I'll give him one nonetheless. So our guest this afternoon is Professor Eunan O'Halpin, recently retired Bank of Ireland Chair of Contemporary History and Director of the TCD Research Centre for Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College Dublin. Eunan has been an influential figure in the Irish Academy in a number of respects. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and a Fellow of Trinity College Dublin. He was a member of the National Archives Advisory Council 2003-2007 and the Department of Justice Archives Advisory Group 2006-2010. He is a joint editor of the Royal Irish Academy Documents in Irish Foreign Policy Series 1996 onwards, and is a member of the government's Expert Advisory Group on Commemorations 2012 going forward. And he has written extensively on the Irish Revolution and 20th century Irish and British history more broadly. Among his publications are The Decline of the Union, British Government in Ireland 1892 to 1920, Defending Ireland and the Irish State and its Enemies since 1922, and Spying on Ireland, British Intelligence and Irish Neutrality during the Second World War. And of course, he has been very prolific in 2020. He has recently published a biography of his great uncle, Kevin Barry, entitled Kevin Barry, an Irish Rebel in Life and Death. And of course, we are here to discuss his recently co-authored volume, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, with Yale University Press. Eunan, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Darren. Thanks to Stephen and Janet also for arranging this and for everybody for coming along.
It's a great honor to have you, Eunan, speak about this wonderful volume. I have it here in my hands. I'm struggling to hold it, let me tell you that in advance. It's a sizable volume here, 700 plus pages, and a remarkable monument, I think, to a career of research on this period. How do you find the experience of having completed this mammoth project? Is it everything you expected it to be in terms of the process, or did it take various turns over the years?
Well, two things. It's not at all what I expected. It took far longer than I anticipated for various reasons, partly because initially I applied for quite a big grant, but I should have applied for a grant twice the size to employ more people. And the consequence of that was that my postdoc, Táthil Corwine, who had a 3-year funded post, and then we found some money for a 4th year, but a huge burden fell on him. I should have actually had 2 or 3 postdocs, and nowadays you'd have a manager as well, a project manager, and it was that certainly was in some ways down to me. I don't think I would have got the money, but at least I would have asked for it. So that's the first thing. Don't be shy with what you look for. I think the second thing is the sort of unpeeling of the onion of sources. When I came up with this idea in 2002 and applied for the grant, I promptly then got very ill. But when I got it in 2003, the sources were relatively limited. The census wasn't there. The Bureau of Military History was just coming, which I had argued for. The military service pensions, which I and others were lobbying for, it turned out weren't going to get released till 2014, and then in stages. There was quite a lot of material in Kew, obviously in the National Archives. There was quite a lot of material in Prony, which we can discuss, because I don't think I made enough use of that really. But there was very little visible at local level. And in fact, it was sometimes through happenstance that you came across material, not only in public institutions like libraries and archives, which in this state are really poorly funded, and some will have quite a lot of material. Others, like Carlow, for example, have almost nothing on the Irish Revolution. It varies from place to place because they've no money, they've no staff, so they can't collect material. Kevin Barry being an example, there's lots of Kevin Barry material sitting in the Kevin Barry, in the family home in Carlow, basically because there hasn't been until recently the capacity in that county to solicit donations. And I'll give a couple of examples in a slideshow of material that I came across in family hands, which should really have been in archives long ago. So there's all sorts of reasons why the other thing is newspapers coming online. Newspapers weren't online, the key newspapers, when this project started. Now, since then, a lot have gone online. The danger, of course, for any of us is we then just consult the ones that we can get online, even pre-COVID. And but the danger there, particularly at local level, is that you may well miss out on material which just doesn't make it to the ones that happen to have been scanned and put up on the internet. And I think we're in now in this, the census is online, the Irish census, death registers are online. There's lots of material online, and the danger is going to be for scholars in future is that we will become, once the wretched virus goes, we'll have become so hooked to the internet that we won't think of going and looking in some old library or knocking on some old lady's door and say, would you happen to have some papers?
That's a really interesting point, that this project was a process in terms of, as you said, funding and administration, but also in terms of the decade of commemorations, the release of archival materials, the digitization of archival materials. So I suppose in a way it's a monument in some respects to that process, in the 21st century, which is fascinating in and of itself. Reading the volume over the last number of weeks, I was struck by how generous it was. And in that respect, I'm considering that in your introduction, you mentioned that this is, a necessary starting point for future research. Whereas when one thinks of the length of time that you've taken and the depth of research that you and Daithí Ó Corráin and others have taken to complete this project, rather than seen as a culmination, you've kind of proposed that it may be a starting point for future research, which is, again, very generous towards other scholars. I'm also mindful that it's not presented in the form of a manuscript text. So did you find that a dilemma at any point, compiling this database of information versus the traditional mode of writing in long form?
I think it was, in a sense, I didn't give enough thought to those very questions when this project got funding. Partly, I say, I was very ill and recovering from surgery and under treatment. If I was doing it now, I'd have thought out these things much better in advance, I assure you. And if I managed to push on, because this is a study of deaths from the 21st of April 1916 to the 31st of December 1921, it does not therefore cover deaths arguably arising from political violence, like Sean Lemass, the former Taoiseach, as I found some years ago, accidentally shot dead his 2-year-old brother in January 1916 in Dublin, and that was never spoken of within the family, even though it was in the newspapers at the time. It never became part of Lemass's biographies. I'm sure there are other deaths, and obviously after the midnight, 31st December 1921, political violence continued to produce deaths on the island of Ireland and elsewhere. Sir Henry Wilson, for example. So we've done all we could do. You could, in order to get a volume out, and there's a lot more. I obviously have quite a lot of material on 1922 and 23 in the database, but certainly not a definitive second volume. But I or somebody else has to do it. The other thing which I haven't done, which we didn't do, we use the county as our unit of measure, which is the only way to do it. But it's also very deceptive. If you look at Antrim, for example, Antrim has a huge hinterland. So even though Belfast is really violent, and in terms of absolute numbers of deaths, it's the third most violent. Antrim's the third most violent county. When you look at it in relation to population, which is our chart 2, Antrim is sort of not that. It's not by any means the most violent county by population, but in practice, Belfast City, but you can't define it by the city. Belfast City, as we know, in 1920 and 21 and running on into 22, is extremely violent. The same problem arises with Londonderry. The county of Londonderry, Derry City, is where almost all fatalities arise, and they arise in overwhelmingly intercommunal strife rather than in say Republican attacks on security forces or anything like that. So the county is an imperfect measure, but it's the one we have to go with. But it can produce deceptive results.
That's a really interesting point, and I think that's been one of the potential debates about where do we go in terms of methodology and studying the Irish Revolution. Obviously, the county study has been to the fore, and that's illustrated best perhaps by the Four Courts Press series edited by Dahi O'Coron and Marianne Lyons, and has produced remarkable research at a granular local level. But to your point, and as your book shows, there were transfers over borders, not least, as you said in your introduction, the idea that people moved across borders, but also died, crossing borders as well. You mentioned and we'll come back to, I think it's also important to recognize potentially, and your book transcends this, that, in histories previously of the War of Independence, there has been a partitionist potential narrative where we separate the Ulster experience, and potentially we might come back to that idea of how to integrate that experience. I wanted to touch on something before we go into your presentation, which is an interesting tension potentially for those who are currently writing on, Irish history or family history, and of course that's your own family's history of the War of Independence, which was very diverse. We've mentioned already Kevin Barry, your grand uncle, but I've marked out as well that you bring out in the introduction Hugh Halfpenny, who was the son of an RIC man and the nephew to others, but was also OC in the IRA, and came down south in 22, joining Garda Síochána. And I think you state in your introduction, be careful what you wish for in researching the past. Presumably you were conscious of that when you're preparing to do this research, that there may be differences in narrative from what you learned over the years.
Well, I was as an historian anyway, because of my work on British as well as Irish history. I'm familiar with the phenomenon, but it is very striking when it is so close to your family or families. But I mean, my overwhelming sense in terms of this study and the family side of it is it helps to get away from the fixation dictated by my grandmother, Kathy Barry, or Kathy Maloney, about Kevin Barry. She spoke only of her dead brother. She never spoke of her husband's dead brother, Paddy Maloney, who was killed in May 1921. So you had this weird, and I just don't think it's peculiar to our family, this weird focus. My granny, on the other side, from County Down, but exiled, because her husband had to leave in 22. She would speak a bit about Kevin Barry. She never talked about her own husband or her own family suffering. She, just as an example, I did ask her in the 70s, was her house ever raided? Her brother Dan Rice was quite a prominent IRA man in County Down. She said, I've raided lots of times. It was terrible. They'd pull everything out. But she told it to me in a kind of joking way. She would have been 15, 16 during these times. And she told me about a song about a terrible girl called Dora who would come in and make a terrible mess, which is the Defence of the Realm Act. But she told her last daughter, her 13th child, who only told me a few years ago, she came back from Canada, she told her a completely different account of the house being raided, because she's a young girl in her teens, and there are these fellas with guns, because the Rice boys are all gone, because they're on the run or whatever. So you're out night in your nightie or whatever with fellas. Some of them soldiers, some of them police. The police wouldn't be so bad. And specials who are local guys looking at you, pointing a gun at you, going through your clothes, and that I think of sexual menace. She never mentioned it to me, but she did to her daughter. And that's another thing which is irrespective of politics, is the dimension of the terror which people would have felt in quite quiet places as well as quite violent places, and women and girls just as much, in some ways more perhaps than men and boys.
It's a fascinating aspect in terms of especially the idea of oral history and storytelling and how narratives potentially change over time. We might come back to that. I'd really like to kind of bring in your presentation now, which really kind of addresses some of the key findings of the book. So I'll defer to you to go through the PowerPoint.
Is it visible yet?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, here we go. Wish me luck, because I was saying earlier, if I hadn't retired on grounds of age, I would have been retired on grounds of technical incompetence. We go from the beginning. Okay, well, that's the title, which I assume you can see. Yeah, just to mention my books. First of all, just to mention the Kevin Barry book, and there is a reason why this ties into the dead, and it's not simply, it's not just because of Kevin's death, but as an example of an earlier point you made, Dara, about family narrative and so on. It was only in writing this book that I looked carefully at Kevin's inverted commas military record, which by the standards of a Dublin volunteer, a Carlow volunteer, was actually quite extensive by the time he was involved in the killing of 3 soldiers, which led to his own death. But the first time Kevin used a gun in anger, it was in a gunfight with the Protestant clergyman in Carlow. Now that, if you put that in the context of what the clergyman might have thought, they were going to steal his gun, but he may well have thought they were coming to kill him because he's a Protestant clergyman. Do you see what I mean? So actions and killings in the case of the dead, which one side might say weren't sectarian or weren't intended as intercommunal, may be interpreted understandably by those suffering the loss or feeling the attack as being precisely sectarian. I mean, if you look to 1921 in Rosslea, where the IRA do a sort of revenge attack and kill two specials, members of Special Constabulary, that's partly because a priest, they said, had been menaced in a previous sort of a set of attacks on Catholic houses in the town. Anyway, to move on with the dead, I've done that. Okay, so the main findings of this study are as follows. For 1916, which is quite rightly kept separate, and we aggregate the figures at the very end, but you have to look at them separately. What's striking about 1916, there are a number of points. One is the very high proportion of civilian deaths because of the battlefield, which is almost entirely Dublin, and that the battlefield at the centre of Dublin is the choice of the rebels, not of the authorities. And you have quite a high proportion of female casualties, 20%, because there's shots being fired everywhere. A lot of the time you don't know who's responsible for killings and things. The same problem arises in Derry in 1920 and in Derry City, and it arises in Belfast in 20 and 21. It's very hard to tell who for definite who fired the shot that killed a particular individual. And we've been rather cautious in assigning responsibility for killings, especially in Derry and Belfast, on that basis. From 17 to 21, we have identified 2,346 fatalities. That's to say people who died by the 31st of December 1921. I'm sure we've missed some soldiers, for example, who would have been wounded and were sent back to Britain to recuperate and died there. But in fact, we did visit a lot of regimental museums and things, and typically there in their magazines and so on, they would note the deaths of veterans. So I don't think we've missed many. There's just over 900 civilians, just under 500 what I call Irish military. Primarily, we would now say IRA, but a few Fianna Air and 2 Common Mon and perhaps 1 or 2 Hibernian rifles or citizen army. The police, over 500 police. They're nearly all RIC, including black and tans, plus auxiliaries. There's a handful of Dublin police killed, as we know, particularly detectives in 1919, 1920. There's a couple of Belfast Harbour police killed, I think more or less accidentally. One definitely by the IRA, the other perhaps by loyalists. And British military, just over 400. The bizarre thing about the British military figure is that 44%, I find it hard to believe myself, but there's an excellent website, the Cairo Gang website, which itemizes deaths and also puts the documentation beside it so you can see. 44% are what would crudely be called own goals. They're responsibility of the British military itself. They're nearly all accidental shootings, because whereas the IRA, for example, had very few weapons and very few bullets most of the time, a British soldier of technically 18, but the case of, for example, of one of the people that Kevin Barry was hanged for killing, Harold Washington, was actually 15. He always had a rifle. He always had ammunition, and he was supposed to have the weapon with him all the time. And that led to an enormous number of accidental shootings where people picked up a rifle where the magazine had been taken out and assumed there wasn't one up the spout, as they say, and shot a friend. In terms of the of female fatalities, it's clear that nobody, by and large, saw women as legitimate targets, women and girls. So most of the fatalities, which there are very few, Belfast, Antrim, which is Belfast, is by far the biggest single site of female deaths. I think it's 27 or 28 of those deaths. I have the exact figure in the book, a rise in Belfast. But by and large, women, nobody singles out women for death, with very few exceptions. The IRA killed 3 women, perhaps more, as spies, but even there, it is clouded in shame and double, multiple versions of stories and excuses and things. So they're very uncomfortable, and that's quite unlike it. Certainly, for example, a lot of civil conflicts elsewhere in Europe around the same time. Well, I mentioned the British military. IRA and the police have roughly the same number of accidental shootings. The police have more traffic accidents because the IRA hardly ever used motor vehicles, whereas the police used them a lot and very often drove very fast, especially in disturbed areas. And responsibilities, we think the Irish military is the IRA, if you like, responsible for about 1,000, police and British military about 1,100, civilians who are very hard to pin down, 72, and undetermined nearly 200, which are mainly Belfast and Derry. Now, there's excellent studies done years ago by Jim McDermott and Alan Parkinson on Belfast when the resources and sources were much less, and we've largely followed them. Now they're much clearer about responsibilities for deaths, but we're following the general rubric from 1916, where it's very hard to tell who shot an individual, even if a shot comes from a particular direction, and so we've been less specific about assigning responsibility there. 1916 to 1921, this shows fatalities per 10,000 population. If there's one good side of COVID, it's made us all familiar with the idea, not just of absolute numbers, but of seeing numbers in relation to the total population. And here, and through some printing error after we did the proofs, this chart number 1 as it is actually the x-axis labeling, it goes wrong in the actual volume. I'm sorry about that. It was after we saw them. Dublin from if you include 1916, has the biggest proportion of deaths by county. If you go to 1917 to 21, which is, as I say, a different story, you'll see that Cork is there. Now, what's striking from an Ulster point of view, if you take a 9-county perspective of Ulster, is the least violent place in terms of fatalities is Tyrone, which is not what I would have guessed, followed by Cavan, followed by Fermanagh, followed by Down, where my grandfather was, followed by Donegal, and then Ulster counties. Wicklow makes an appearance, followed by Laois or Queen's County, and then we get Armagh. But very striking is, and this is the problem with using I can't even see now with my glasses. If we go to Antrim is relatively, proportionately, has fewer deaths than Offaly, Kings County. Now, that's a joke because Offaly has about 23 deaths or something. Antrim has 232. But that's the problem. Antrim is a big county outside the city of Belfast. And that's the downside of this kind of measurement. And this should tell us something about when we're doing comparative studies, as you are, Dara. We have to be really careful about other people's yardsticks as well as our own. I'll just go on. Whoops. Yeah, just to say things that turn up. And I mean, one of the things I want to touch on in this talk is where there's so much sort of Republican and nationalist memory in relation to the 6-county Ulsters, as well as in relation to the rest of Ireland. And that's partly because of with the military service pensions, especially, there are incentives to put your story out there and to make claims and to say, yeah, I shot 3 specials and so on. But there's also there remains in Ireland, because we've very underdeveloped archives tradition and library tradition. The enormous amounts of material remain in private hands. In my own very historically conscious family, in 2011, I was going through the papers of my mother's sister, who was the last of Kevin Barry's sister's family to die, and I came across this envelope and written on the outside in my grandmother's handwriting as Commandant Peadar Clancy. Now, Peadar Clancy was killed in the guardroom of Dublin Castle on the night of Bloody Sunday, or probably the next sometime the next morning, we don't know what time, while allegedly trying to escape along with two other people. There's a very graphic account by a comrade of what the bodies looked like. But this looks to me, I mean, this is a lock of hair. I can only take it that it's a lock of Paddy Clancy's hair. It was really weird. It was actually stuck between two envelopes. When I opened this envelope, I didn't know what was in it. It was a really odd feeling to have somebody's body parts, in a sense, nearly, cascading onto a floor. I had to pick up what I could. And so memory lies in private hands so much, if you like, on the nationalist or Republican side. And I wonder where the equivalent mementos lie elsewhere. And again, this actually was shown to me in 2018 in Kevin Barry's home, and the family home in Tom Bay in Carlow. And it was shown to me quite casually, and it was since been described in the Irish Times as being the product of a girl being cropped, her hair being cropped, although at the time the family had a different version, that it was actually belonged to a relative who'd become a nun and had her hair cropped. But if it is the former, if it is the product of a punishment of a young local girl, it's an odd thing to keep, I would have thought, to have kept in the first place, because it was captured in December 1920 when Michael Barry, Kevin's brother, was arrested, and the army then returned it in March 1921. There's a covering letter saying, here's a lock of hair. But when you see it, it's not a lock of hair, it's somebody's plait, some unfortunate Carlow girl or woman. And again, it's an unsettling artifact. It goes to artifacts, hardly the term, but it's also an example of where so much material from the sort of independent side is there. On the same lines, I'll just show you this, which was in until my uncle Pat Brennan spoke to me at a funeral. It was in a chicken shed, a tin box in a chicken shed in Cootehill in County Cavan. Pat was from Scottstown. His father, Tom, had been very active in the IRA in 1920 and 21, and never said a word to his kids about the War of Independence or Civil War. He talked about 1798. He never said anything. But that's his gun. The gun was quite likely used in the killing of a woman called Kate Carroll, who was shot as an informer, ridiculously, in the view of many Republican veterans as well as of others in 1921. She was a local poaching maker and very scattered. But what's also interesting is Brennan has a document here. I'll just briefly run through it. Say what he has said. It's a history of his unit's activities, and he says in the preceding page, we discovered through the post that somebody's writing to the RIC, giving them information as to where the boys are staying, where weapons are hidden, and also complaining about crackdown on poaching makers. So this case was investigated by Battalion IOTB. Found that the letter was written by Kate Carroll, case blah, 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 and he goes on and on and on. She's warned, and then it ends. Evidence after she's warned, proof was forthcoming next day when another document detailed the men who had given the warning, and he writes, etc. Now, if you turn over the page, he continues the story of what the battalion did next, but he leaves out through this the fact they took Kate Carroll out and shot her. And he has himself as TB, Tom Brennan, the third person. Now that material is now, thanks to Pat Brennan, his son, is now in Monaghan County Museum, but it could have stayed in the shed, and rotted away. You see the water damage and so on, had he not happened to mention it to me. And there must be the equivalent kind of material, is what I'm trying to say, on the Unionist side. Must be there, Unionist sides and Crown Forces sides. There must be these kind of mementos and things, and trophies and disturbing artifacts. And so what are we missing in terms of in the dead? 9 county and 6 county Ulster. Probably there's a lot of material, and the irony, the paradox is there's far more on republicanism than there is on particularly on loyalist paramilitaries of one sort or another, or on the specials and so on. And this is a difficult question, but how with the exception, Alton LaVey being a big exception, how is the memory of those years conserved and remembered and passed on? I'm thinking that there's a lot of Republican material on the abduction and killing of a man called Willie Fraser, the shopkeeper from Newtown, whatever, near Newry. In early 1922, they stop his lorry. There are two little kids, his daughter, another kid in the lorry. They send them off. They take him off into County Louth, and they kill him and bury him. Now, there's a little file in Stormont in Proney, on a Stormont file, but there's a lot in Republican recollections, especially in the O'Fee Library in Armagh. But where's the parallel? With his family and descendants and his neighbors and his community and his, I'm at a loss to explain. And finally, just generally the sense of defending Ulster, and where can we find local narratives and individual narratives, because we're awash with people who, particularly if they're looking for a pension or looking for local prominence, who'll say, we waited all night for 10 weeks in a row for the specials. They actually never came, so I never fired a shot. But, give me a medal anyway. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. How do I get rid of this?
You can leave it there for the moment if people can have a look.
Okay, so let's go. Yeah.
Sure. So I think that's really interesting, and actually it leads me to the next point for people who are listening. Don't forget to add your comments and questions in the chat function. We'll get to those towards the end, and especially if there are those who are aware of family collections in local areas and so on. That would really be interesting to see if there were materials available which we were unaware of previously. And I think what you raised, especially regarding the personal experiences, is very pertinent, especially as it relates to Ulster in terms of the 9 counties. I mean, in your book, you mark out that 85% of the deaths were civilians.
In Antrim,
that's in Antrim, in contrast to, let's say, 34% for Cork and 45% for Dublin. So, I'm guessing that there is there are repositories in some respects of memories of this period on the part of victims' families. It would have gone down in at least oral traditions. So that's an interesting, divergence from the Southern narrative. By contrast, then, I think there were less than 30 deaths of British military, members of the USC in Belfast in 1920, which strikes me as a very low figure. Can you account for that potentially, that rather low figure in Belfast?
I think I can. For the IRA in Belfast, which is in Antrim and in County Down, where my grandfather was for a time the vice brigadier or whatever, they didn't have any weapons. They were overwhelmed by a very powerful state at local level and by a very powerful and aggressive, well, not aggressive necessarily, but a very powerful majority community. I think I'm trying to remember, but in 1970-21, the pie chart for Antrim, you'll see that I think it's 3% of the 232 people who we've recorded as dying. They're almost all 1920 and 21. 3% are IRA. In other words, 3% is probably 7. And they weren't necessarily, I can't remember if they were even all killed in conflict with the security forces. There could have been 1 or 2 accidental deaths or deaths in prison or whatever arising there. So the IRA was really not, however, it was not enormously active. And there were other people other than the IRA in terms of communal defense. Clearly there's ex-servicemen, there's just locals, because guns were not nearly as, the sort of gun culture that even I grew up with, even before the Northern Troubles in this state, it was always very hard to own a weapon, even a shotgun. Whereas in Belfast, for example, there was loads of guns that came back from the war. There was loads of UVF weapons and so on and so on. But they weren't primarily being used by the IRA, even on the nationalist side. I mean, a lot of the intercommunal killing and so on is being done, whether justified or not, in terms of defense, is being done by people other than, as it were, signed up IRA volunteers. And the same on the loyalist side, and we know almost nothing. I mean, there's painful amounts of detail about IRA organization. East Down, my grandfather had the glorious title of Vice Brigadier, and there weren't many people it wasn't a big brigade that he was half leader of or whatever. It's, whereas on the loyalist side, I don't know who's organizing stuff. Who's saying, let's burn these bastards out? Who's saying, you lot go that way, you lot go that way, make sure we have the guns, get the stuff? Who's doing the planning and the concerted attacks? It can't all be a few drunks, just spilling out of a pub. And we don't, on the other side, you have this enormous narrative particularly on the formal Republican side, of all these people with big titles like, Quartermaster General and all this kind of thing. And in practice, partly I think because there's reputational stuff, and also because there's medals ultimately and pensions. So you have to describe an organization very formally. But where's the loyalist side of that? We know roughly about the specials, although their records, as we know, I hope we hear about that in Prony. There's probably more to come out from their records. But the informal, if you like, defenders of the unionist community, we know nothing. At least I know nothing. I know there's a couple of groups, the Imperial Guard and so on, but even there we know relatively very little.
As you said, the scale of the violence, especially in 1920 and 1921, would suggest that there was a degree of coordination. I just think it's a very interesting point as well to compare, let's say, the lack of response on the part of Unionists and Loyalists in 1916 to the Rising, for example, in terms of outbreaks of violence locally, to, I think, what the book, The Dead of the Revolution, suggests is perhaps an overreaction to, let's say, isolated incidents of violence, even, the killing of the RIC Inspector Smith, for example, resulted in then, disproportionate violence in 1920. So there's an interesting, tension there between 1916 and 1920.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I've asked it. Nobody seems interested. How come not a dog barks in Belfast? You have the Belfast Volunteers coming back from Coal Island or from Dungannon. Many of them probably in uniform, although they dumped their weapons. Everybody knew there was trouble in Dublin. The Kaiser, was said to be present, and certainly it inspired the Rising. And yet nobody threw a brick through even a church window. And it didn't take much to start things off, even on an informal kind of rioting, stoning basis, I would have said, especially in Belfast in those years. Yet in 1916, there's some kind of discipline. I don't say it's a master plan, but why is there such restraint? And it can't because they're all off at the war, because there's loads of people in protected industries, loads of skilled workers and this and that. There's plenty of people, but it's very interesting that there isn't, because they do see the enemy in their midst, because the Dennis McCullough and his men go back up. It's amazing, I think.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I think it's interesting the way your book is arranged as well, chronologically, by day. So I literally went through page by page and identified, Ulster deaths, so to speak. And it's remarkable that the first death that I could see of someone in Ulster was actually 4th of June, 1918, Patrick Duffy in Monaghan, who, according to your description, was drunk and attacked a British soldier, I think, and then was bayoneted to death. So there's a large period of time where there are no violent deaths attributable to political violence. And again, there's another gap until the summer of 1920. So there are periods of quiescence, at least in terms of fatalities, which, is very interesting in terms of the temporality of the War of Independence. I mean, judging by your book, would you suggest potentially the summer of 1920 as a more definitive starting date for the Irish Revolution, the War of Independence, for example?
Well, it depends who you ask and take your pick. The advantage, if that's the right term, of Solohead Beg in January 1919 is it happens to be on the same day that the first Dáil beats. So there's a kind of even though it was unintended, there's a kind of a symmetry there. Thank you very much. And the first Dáil, after all, issues yet another proclamation of independence, and so on and so on. So that's, I think, gives you the kind of the start of an obvious start, and that's the sort of accepted start. In terms of barracks attacks, of course, as Daithí, being a Kerry-man, would point out, there's 2 volunteers killed in a barracks attack the previous year, in Gorta Clay. Forgive me if I mispronounce it, where they're taken by surprise while themselves raiding a barracks, and you could argue that that's the first start of concerted armed action, albeit at local level and not sanctioned against the state. But But in terms of Ulster, if you like, as in many counties, yeah, it's the summer of 1920 before any sort of sustained violence is experienced.
And then I note as well, and you obviously bring this out in the detail, that again, the temporalities that we assume from a Southern perspective to the War of Independence don't necessarily fit in terms of, let's say, the truce of July 1921, because we see another what's called Bloody Sunday after the truce in parts of Northern Ireland.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's. I mean, the truce is most observed, you have to say, by Crown forces, right? With one exception in December 1921, when a drunken policeman throws a grenade at a train carrying some released prisoners back towards Cork. He does that in Thurles, I think. But by and large, but there's a certain amount of Republican killing that goes on outside, if you like, this Northern Ireland as it has become under the Government of Ireland Act. But as compared with what's happening in Belfast, it is especially in Belfast, it's almost of no consequence. There's a few vengeance killings where they reckon Sergeant Smith or Constable Jones was responsible for killing somebody over some atrocity, in the IRA through lack of discipline go and try to kill him. But there's very little sort of concerted violence, whereas as we know in Belfast, it's absolute mayhem.
I think it's interesting as well. Michael Hopkinson, in his book The Irish War of Independence, makes the point, and he again has a separate chapter on the Ulster and the War of Independence as opposed to integrating it into the narrative. But he makes the point that the fact that the truce took place so soon after the establishment of partition suggested that the establishment of Northern Ireland essentially precluded the development or proliferation of violence, and that resolved one of the major prompts for violence during this period. Whereas I think your book, by detailing on a daily basis the continuation of violence, even at a local level, suggests that actually, December 21, even there were significant deaths in Belfast and its environs, and therefore perhaps the truce is a misleading, boundary, so to speak.
Well, it is misleading, but the truce, boundary is the word, because it seems to me, with all due respect to anyone who fought for called Irish freedom, that in terms of the high politics of this and the high strategy, what the British government wanted to do, where I'm going to sound like Boris Johnson, is get the Government of Ireland Act over the line, right? Which they did in the autumn of 1920, and get Northern Ireland established. Thank you very much, 6-county Ulster. And they got all that. And I think there was an understandable inability at the time, but it's less understandable now because 100 years later, to appreciate that Lloyd George did have a grand strategy, that he was persuaded that you have towards a six county with the possible, obviously with the Boundary Commission that might have done some trimming at the edges, but he certainly wasn't. He was convinced there had to Ulster, if you like, had to be protected, even though it was a redefined Ulster, because Ulster, in 1919 is 9 counties. In 1921, it's suddenly 6, right? But I think we underestimate the degree of political will in London, especially in 1920, when they know what the act is going to be. We've got to get this bloody thing through, and we have to get it settled, and we have to get Northeast Ulster looked after, and we'll slug it out thereafter. And then, once Northern Ireland is there in being, the arguments are about things like, issues, symbolic issues, where there's not going to be agreement about a republic and so on and so on. But it's not about the idea of 26 county self-governing dominion. That's okay with London, but we're going to put manners on them first. Partly, I think, because they fear that otherwise, the South will drive towards the North once they get the chance.
Yes, to be continued, as I say. Ewan, I'm contractually obliged, as a member of the HRC Global Irish Evolution Project, of course, to bring in the international dimension. And I think it's interesting you mentioned in your introduction that, the number of deaths, and in the statistical sense, raises questions about how Ireland was understood in terms of empire, and colonialism. It wasn't a far-flung colonial holding; it was a part of the United Kingdom. And of course, especially with the emergence of debate and discourse over empire, decolonization, and so on, I'm wondering, if we are to think comparatively, how should we continue? I mean, we've been doing it for a number of years now. Our commemorations in a comparative sense. You bring out potential comparisons between Amritsar and Bloody Sunday, although the numbers, as you point out, are very disproportionate in terms of the deaths. I was also mindful of the Samil movement in Korea, where 2 million Koreans participated in 1,500 demonstrations early 1919, and that saw 7,500 killed and 15,000 injured by the Japanese. So, do you think that? What do you think we have to learn essentially from other countries' experiences of empire, and do we, in some regards, have to accept that Ireland was not the beneficiary, but was experienced an element of white privilege when it came to disproportionate use of force?
Well, I think it's more than. I mean, this is a part of a bigger question as to whether Ireland's a colony or not, right? I'm not so sure about it. But in terms of white privilege, well, yeah, because Ireland, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland until whatever it was, till I suppose December 1922, when the treaty is a year old. So Ireland, and yet Ireland, plainly, nationalist Ireland has always been. Had always been a bit of a place apart because of the history of the 19th century of land agitation, of repression, of Fenianism, and so on and so on, and obviously until 1828, whatever, of overwhelmingly Catholic character being, in a sense, a slightly de-Britishizing factor in Irishness. It annoys people in Britain when I point this out. But at least our constitution, which people give out about it all the time, at least it has a clear distinction between church and state. So none of us are under the illusion that Prince Charles or whatever is the head of our church, or I beg your pardon, Queen Elizabeth, and the Protestant nature of the British Constitution. I don't mean in everyday life, but that's an element that makes a largely Catholic geographic and political entity within the UK in the 19th and 20th centuries somehow different. And it's not all the Catholics' fault.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that we could have that conversation even separately over an hour. We're going to turn to some